Okay, back to the telephones. Our special guest, Dr. Kevin Gutzman, author of the Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution. And we'll get to Jack Hunter in just a minute here. Now, going back to the end of last hour, I think I set it up pretty well that the Union that once existed, that was created in 1787 in convention, then ratified in 1788, was ended when the war between the states ended. You would agree with that, wouldn't you, Kevin?
Well, yes, yes, because it's no longer voluntary. In fact, we have several states that were conquered and forced into it. Now, you said at the end of last hour that it's possible somebody could conclude that this was a good thing. In fact, there's a leading neoconservative people may be familiar with if they occasionally look at nationalreview.com named Michael Ledeen, L-E-D-E-E-N. This is a fellow who's been arguing for years that we need to have a war with Iran, for example. Full-throated supporter of Iraq and Afghanistan and today's Libya and intervention and so on. He has said, actually explicitly, that he thinks the Confederates were right on the Constitution, but it's a good thing that the Union won the war. So there you go. That's what you get.
The Confederates were right on the Constitution, but it's a good thing the Union won the war?
Yes, that's what he said.
Wow. I don't even know what to say to that. So what is the purpose of these written constitutions anyways? what do you need one for?
Apparently to empower people with good moral projects to enforce them on the rest of us. That seems to be the purpose.
Now, let's just stick with Fort Sumter for a moment here. And in reading some of the history that I could find, and as we talked about last hour, it's still not a very popular thing to question the orthodoxy of Lincoln's war against the southern states, and certainly the amount of lives that were lost. It was all for a good purpose, though, Mike. So what? 600,000 dead. Who cares? Big deal. Look, you Southerners got served what you deserved and what have you. There was also the rampant destruction of private property. There was the indiscriminate bombing and killing of civilians, which did not happen for the most part in any of the northern states. It did happen all across South Carolina, North Carolina, into Georgia, and certainly here in my home state of Louisiana. There were countless tales of the atrocities that were committed by Union soldiers here. The war was not necessary or a foregone conclusion, though, was it, Professor?
No, it certainly wasn't necessary, and the way that it was conducted certainly wasn't necessary. And in fact, nowadays, people who were at the head of the Union Army would be considered to be war criminals. So, for example, General Sherman's army in Georgia used anti-personnel shells against Atlanta, even though Atlanta was undefended at the time. They just decided, as Sherman had said earlier, he was going to make the South howl, and by that he meant he was going to starve and burn civilians. So, you know, it's just a very ugly story, the story of the way the war was fought. And besides that, there's also the story of the extent to which President Lincoln and his administration just flouted the law. That is, for example, at the beginning of the war, he decided that likely Maryland was going to secede, and so he suspended the writ of habeas corpus, which means, another way of putting that is that he decided to tell his generals that arbitrary arrest was going to be permissible, even though the Constitution empowers Congress to suspend the writ of habeas corpus, not the president. In fact, the Chief Justice of the United States Supreme Court, Roger Brooke Taney, issued an order that a particular fellow should receive the writ of habeas corpus, and Lincoln instructed his military commanders to ignore the Chief Justice's order. The Chief Justice said, the President has no right to be suspending this writ, that we have civilian courts still functioning normally in Maryland, and this man ought to be brought here, and I need to have an explanation why he's been arrested. And through the rest of the war, Lincoln suspended the writ repeatedly in various parts of the North where civilian courts were sitting. This is just one example of the way that Lincoln ignored the Constitution. Actually, there are several other notable ones. It was, for example, only during the Civil War that for the first time the Union government undertook to conscript people into the military, which I have argued in who killed the Constitution is completely unconstitutional.
Right.
That is, there is no power granted by the Constitution to the federal government to force people into the Army. But, well, if you're going to make an omelet, you got to break a few eggs. And actually, Lincoln, the way he put it was, well, shall all the laws but one fall so that this one could be enforced? And actually, he took that attitude toward basically every law. So essentially what it came to was, are we going to follow the law when I think there's a good alternative? And it was only during the war that for the first time, under the current Constitution, the federal government got into the business of printing money. And the funny thing about that is, and again, there's nothing in the Constitution that says the federal government can print money. And the funny thing about that is that Lincoln in 1864 had the opportunity to replace Chief Justice Taney, and he appointed to that position Salmon Chase, who had been Lincoln's Treasury Secretary.
Right.
It was then Chase who, immediately after the war, was Chief Justice when a case came to the court raising the question, was it legal for the Union government to print money during the war? And Chase, who had been the Treasury Secretary, in fact, whose picture was on the $1 bill, Chase was the one who decided no, it wasn't. So it's a very interesting sequence of events.
Was this a legal tender case? Was this one of the legal?
That's right.
Okay.
That's right. So you have the legal tender case. You have Merriman, which is the one about the writ of habeas corpus. And there's also another case called prize cases, in which the question was whether the Union blockade of southern ports was legal and constitutional. Because on one hand, domestically, Lincoln didn't want to recognize the independence of the South, of course. But then in what was called the Law of Nations, which is the precursor to today's international law, you could only blockade a foreign country. You couldn't blockade a couple of towns. You couldn't blockade part of your own country. And so the Supreme Court, which always found a way to validate whatever Lincoln was doing,
right.
The Supreme Court said, well, for domestic purposes, the South is not independent, but for international purposes, it is independent. How about that?
Oh, God.
Yeah.
Stop it. Make it stop. I want to read something to you from Romsdale, Lincoln and Fort Sumter, because we're going to get into Fort Sumter here now. It is Fort Sumter Day. When the Confederate batteries around Charleston Harbor opened fire on Fort Sumter in the early morning hours of 12 April 1861, they signaled the beginning of the most calamitous tragedy in the history of the American people. Because the Confederate authorities ordered the attack, it is generally held that they were directly responsible for the horrors of the ensuing 4 years. Certainly that was the feeling in the North then and afterwards, and it became the verdict of austere historians. Whether the war was inevitable in any case is a question that need not be raised here. It has been the subject of endless disputation, and is one to which no conclusive answer can be given. But even though it be conceded that if the conflict had arisen, or had not arisen from Fort Sumter, from the Fort Sumter crisis, it would have sprung from some other incident growing out of the secession of the Cotton States. The actual firing of the first shot placed the Southerners under a great moral and material disadvantage. The general Northern conviction that the, quote, rebels, end quote, had made an unprovoked attack upon the little federal garrison added thousands of volunteers to the Union armies and strengthened the determination of the Northern people to carry the struggle through to the complete subjugation of the South. The Confederate leaders who ordered the bombardment were not vicious, feeble-minded, irresponsible, or inexperienced men. As even a casual investigation will show, they had been fully aware of the danger of taking the initiative in hostilities and had hoped for peace. How then could they be so blind as to place themselves in this manifest disadvantage? And it is explained in greater detail in Mr. Romsdale's book, Lincoln and Fort Sumter, but I have a short description of it here. Apparently, there was a meeting between Abraham Lincoln and one of his advisors, and Lincoln coyly suggested that, look, we may not be able to attack them, that may be unconstitutional, but we may be able to get them to attack us, and we may be able to trick them into it, knowing full well that Charleston Harbor was in the sovereign state of South Carolina, Professor Gutzman. Would it then be sovereign territory, and if a frigate under Union flag bury Union soldiers with heavy armament. Allegedly now, this is to resupply Fort Sumter, enters the harbor and refuses to stop, then what alternative did General Beauregard have other than to not fire on it? What were his choices on the day?
Well, Beauregard didn't do it on his own initiative. He'd been ordered by President Davis to initiate the bombardment. So it wasn't as if he came to that conclusion. It was the highest authority in the Confederate government that made that decision. But yes, certainly it's true that if one recognized the sovereignty and independence of South Carolina, then trying to provision foreign soldiers who had been asked to leave and had not done so and apparently didn't intend to do or intended not to do so, trying to provision them was an act of war. So the first act of war was taken by the Union, actually. This is, very ingenious kind of propaganda victory. What if you were Davis or if you were Beauregard, to have allowed reprovisioning of people at Fort Sumter and reinforcement of the force at Fort Sumter would have been to recognize that your country wasn't independent. I often say to people, look, imagine today that Spain decided they wanted to pull out of NATO. And so they told the other NATO countries, we're leaving. We don't think it's worth having ourselves be subjected to periodic bombing by Islamist extremists, and we're just not going to be part of NATO. It doesn't do us any good. If they said that and the U.S. Responded by saying, well, NATO is permanent and we're keeping our bases. In fact, we're going to reinforce them. How do you think the Spanish government would respond to that? I think they'd consider it an act of war and maybe they'd attack our bases. I mean, what else would they do? It's just predictable. I can't imagine that people would say, well, if the Spanish government did try to cut off supplies to American bases in Spain and then attack them, that would be justification for flattening every city in Spain, killing half the people and half the men in Andalusia. People actually, I think nowadays, don't recognize how much destruction the war ended up causing. For example, in Mississippi, of white men of military age, 18 to 40, half of them were killed in the war. Nowadays, you hear people complain that the war we have going on in Iraq, which has led to something like 4,400 deaths, is awfully expensive and terribly bloody. Imagine if half the men age 18 to 40, were dead tomorrow or had died in the last 4 years. It's astounding, really. It's amazing to think of that. The only other countries I can think of that have had that kind of mortality inflicted on it, well, Germany in World War II ended up suffering that kind of military loss.
Right.
Who else? I can't even think of any.